Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the last meeting of our 21st year of this roundtable. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Gary Eccelbarger, who is the author of several books about the period of the American Revolution as well as the Civil War. And his most recent book, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, is George Washington's Momentous Year, 12 Months that Transformed the Revolution. And he's going to be talking with us about the first 10 days at Valley Forge. So, Gary, the floor is yours.
All right, folks, thanks for attending, and thanks, Bob, and the roundtable for inviting me for this talk. If we're talking about Washington and the Continental Army in December, we usually are talking about two events. The more prominent one, of course, is what the roundtable is named for, which is the crossing of the Delaware. But of course, you also associate December, Washington, and the Continental Army with what you see in this Trago painting, Valley Forge. And I'm calling this a new look at the first week of Valley Forge. I'm primarily going to focus on the first 4 days, and I'm actually going to, at the very end, intrigue a little bit with talking about the Valley Forge encampment as a whole, and hopefully it fosters some discussion. Because a lot has been written about Valley Forge, but we also have some displaced stories about it, some tradition that historians have really not been able to piece together. So I'm going to give you my attempt at piecing together what happened during the first week. And at the same time, I'm going to try to revise, not for the sake of making that word a pejorative for revision, but because I think it's necessary, especially with the 250th anniversary coming up, to get the story right in terms of the encampment force that existed at Valley Forge. So without further ado, we'll take it from there. For those that have read a lot about Valley Forge, you've heard about these seemingly disparate things that were going on in the early part of the encampment. You know that they were constructing their huts, which were these 14 by 16 foot, really essentially log cabins. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. You might have heard that there was a mutiny that was attempted to take place there. And that was kind of related to the commissary woes, to the quartermaster deficiencies. And then you've also perhaps heard about an early plan to attack Philadelphia early on in the Valley Forge encampment. And you've also, some of you might have even read that the soldiers had voracious appetites. So I'm going to try to put all this together and make a story out of this that hopefully makes sense and follow a chronology. All right, so here's the traditional look at the story, and I'm essentially summarizing all the sources that I've read about this, and it goes something like this, right? Washington marched into Valley Forge on December 19th, 1777, with 11,000. That's usually the number you hear. Sometimes they bring it up to 12,000 downtrodden soldiers who immediately constructed their huts for the winter. The encampment dwindled, and what's in quotes there, as low as 5,000 to 6,000 at some point, comes from a teaching resource that actually existed in the Valley Forge Park. So I'm quoting it directly from them. In the midwinter, but improved camp sanitation, new recruits, and returning sick and furloughed soldiers resulted in an army marching away from Valley Forge on June 19th, exactly 6 months later, exceeding 16,000 soldiers. So what that leads us to is this notion of the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? You had the ebb of the Continental Army in Valley Forge, and all of a sudden the great mythical bird has risen from the ashes that leads you to the mountain. All right, so what you have here is the army marching from the Gulf, all right? And that's the hanging rock that still exists today at the Gulf. And what do you see there? Same thing you saw on my introductory slide, a big winter scene that's occurring here on this 8-mile march from the Gulf. There's a lot of images of the soldiers marching into Valley Forge, and you're going to see the common theme in all of them, and that's this winter scene that you see right here. This is another march to Valley Forge that comes from a period book. And here's another as well, the March to Valley Forge. Unfortunately, this isn't historically accurate, because there you see soldiers looking like they're marching in about at least about 4 to 6 inches of snow there. There probably was no snow on the ground on the day that they actually marched to Valley Forge from the Gulf. The temperature was cold. It was about 30 degrees, but for 3 days before that, it was near 40 degrees. And it rained almost all day for 2 of those 3 days. So the snow that fell on December 13th and December 14th, which encased the Gulf encampment in a blanket of white. Probably didn't exist at the time that the soldiers marched into Valley Forge. In fact, the real significant snowfall is going to occur actually on Christmas night on December 25th. So probably no snow. So don't mean to bust that tradition, but we got to get the story right. And here's another tradition that you hear. There's this 11,000 syndrome that has been permeating the literature, not just for Valley Forge, but seemingly the size of the army at the Gulf, the size of the army at Brandywine, anything having to do with the Philadelphia campaign deals with this number 11,000. And that's the number of troops that we're always told have entered Valley Forge. And I always had a problem with that because there are 15 Continental brigades that entered Valley Forge along with artillery and dragoons, and it's that 11,000 always seemed too small to me. And I did publish an article working with Michael Harris, who wrote a lot about the Philadelphia campaign, as many of you know. And we collaborated on coming up with some returns. But I want to show you where I first saw this number first depicted. And it comes from 1850 and it carries on into the 1800s, 1900s, and now into the 21st century. And this is the source of it. It's George Washington himself. By the way, the image that you see here on the left, this is the true Valley Forge image of George Washington. It was sketched by Charles Wilson Peale in September of 77, but he actually made miniatures of that sketch maybe as early as November, but we know he definitely did it in February of 1778 at Valley Forge because he sold 4 of these, and this is one of them, to Martha Washington in the encampment when she was there for $56 a piece. So he had quite an industry going there. He made miniatures of a lot of soldiers. And this is kind of a rare image of Washington. So this is the way Washington is depicted at this period. It's the first image that we have of him since May of 76, the Hancock image. And this one in the miniature, it's keep in mind that Peale likes to powder his subject's hair. In many instances, Washington throughout the encampment didn't have powdered hair, so his hair is going to be much darker than you see in this image, but it's the same guy. He's in uniform and shoes. He's nearly 6 feet 3 inches tall. He's probably a little over 200 pounds, and that's the Valley Forge image we have of him. And this is what he says in a very famous statement in which you hear about the army either going to starve, disperse, or dissolve. I'll bring up that quote later. It's from the same letter to the Continental Congress. And this is where the number 11,000 comes from. First put together in 1850 and carried on through them. This comes from his December 23rd report to Congress, and just focus on what's highlighted here. We have 2,898 men now in camp unfit for duty. And then he goes on to say that we have 8,200 men in camp fit for duty. And you add it together, and what do you get? You get 11,098. And they rounded down to 11,000. And that's exactly where the 11,000 comes from. And everybody has quoted that from 1850 for the next 170, almost 175 years now. You're going to see that number always quoted. And that's exactly where it comes from. But here's a problem with it. It doesn't count nearly the number of troops that were actually existing in the camp when he wrote that dispatch. Okay. So if you take a look at the problem that's going to confront historians who believed in the 11,000, you see this. All right. And Herrera is one of the more recent ones to publish this number of rations consumed. 4 million pounds of food were consumed in December and in January, about equal amounts for both months. All right. And when you break it down by day, that's the equivalent of 23,000 rations per day. So what has vexed historians for these 150 years that we're focusing on this is, how in the world do you have 23,000 rations consumed by 11,000 people at Valley Forge? And this is my composite of all the explanations that I have seen in print. And let's break them down. And sometimes you have a combination of things. Well, they say you have added militia that are also consuming the rations. Well, that's true, but you don't have 12,000 militia added to 11,000 soldiers. You only have a few thousand militia, and they're not always active in the theater, and they're not always near Valley Forge, so the rations aren't getting to them. But it certainly doesn't add up to the 23,000. Then you have this comment. increased calorie needs for cold weather and hut construction. Now, in my previous life, I just retired a few months ago, with in a field of nutritional biochemistry applied in a clinical field. I could tell you that that's garbage. Okay. Yes, they increase their calories for the couple of days that they took to build their huts. And yes, your temper when you're trying to keep your body warm, you expend a few extra calories for that, but it doesn't double your calorie consumption, nothing close to that. So that doesn't come close to explaining it. And then you get this idea of overly generous issuances. Well, I guess that would make sense that you would certainly have more rations than the number of troops, but there is no evidence whatsoever that you had an oversupply of 10,000 rations per day, which is what's being suggested here at the top. What these historians have never considered, and it's dragged on from the 19th to the 20th and into the 21st century, it's a disregard of the obvious. And the obvious is there were 23,000 rations distributed because there were 23,000 mouths to feed, not 11,000. So let me break it down for you. All right. And I'm not the first to bring this up. This information's been published now for 50 years since the bicentennial. One of the greater sources, very underused and underappreciated, obviously, is Charles Lesser's Sinews of Independence. He, in a monthly basis, compiled monthly troop strength reports throughout the Revolutionary War. It's not really about Valley Forge, but in his book, there are six troop strength returns that are published, and he puts it in a more readable form. And he shows very clearly from the numbers present and what you can derive from the rest that there are a heck of a lot more than 11,000 soldiers at Valley Forge. Well, as I mentioned before, Mike Harris and I, when we were working on this, and we published in JAR about this as well, we found 21 additional weekly and monthly reports and field returns during the Valley Forge encampment. So that makes 27 returns. We basically covered every single week of the encampment with an official record, an official troop strength return. And we could look at the ebb and flow of troops entering and leaving the camp over that period of time. There's also commissary returns, the rations drawn, which I alluded to with the December and January draws. But there's also one that exists for June 7th. And then if you look at bookending returns, ones that are conducted right after the Army leaves Valley Forge in the middle of June, and a couple of the ones that occurred like near White Marsh at that time, you can look at that and compare it to the Valley Forge troop strength returns, and you get a much bigger and a much clearer understanding of what's going on. So let's take a look at these results. This is an example of about half of a return. It's a big panoramic view, and I'm only showing you the left-handed side. Now, this one is in Valley Forge, and this is a February return, but it's a clear vision. I want you to see it. And you see, if you could follow my cursor, there are several rows, and most of these rows depict the different brigades that are known by their brigade commanders. Okay. And at the bottom, there's some additional regiments that existed at Valley Forge at that time. So those are the rows. But if you look at the columns, this set of columns right here are all the field officers. These columns right here are all the staff officers. These two columns, sergeants, drums, and fife, this is your non-commissioned personnel. And then you look at all the totals of these encamped individuals at the very bottom. You cut across at the very bottom and you see 7 and 22 and 27 go to the right. And it goes all the way here to 952 and 666. These 14 columns have never been added for the troop strength, and they exist at Valley Forge. They don't count officers. The only thing that Washington counted in that December 23rd return was what are called rank and file. It's basically privates and corporals. And that's this column that's partially depicted here. So you have to count these men. They're building huts. They're eating the rations. They have to be counted. And in February, there's 2,500 of these men that aren't counted. All right. So I want you to appreciate that. Now, on this next slide, I'm going to show, and I'm going to already apologize in advance. It's going to look a little bit fuzzy. But what I'm going to show you is the next few columns to the right that are off to the right of this panoramic view that's looking only at the rank and file. And I'm only showing the first two rows, which are these two Virginia brigades, Woodford's and Scott's brigades. So let me bring you to that one. And I'm only showing you the column headings, and you see these two rows of brigades. This is, it's off the page on the left, but that's present fit for duty. So you know you count those. This is the rank and file. These are the rank and file numbers. Then you see sick present, you see sick absent. Then you see this column that basically says unfit for lack of clothes and shoes. Then you see this column on command and this column right here on furlough. Well, let's knock out the ones that we know that we don't count, right? Soldiers that are on furlough and soldiers over here that are sick absent, of course we don't count them. They're not in the camp, all right? They're on furlough in their home states, or they're sick absent in the hospital. Now, hopefully the sick absent recover. We know that many of them don't. Many of them will die in those outer perimeter hospitals, but some of them do get better and come back to camp. We will see them on subsequent returns, returning either as sick present or fit for duty. So we don't count them when they're absent. So that's easy. But look at these other columns. These are never counted in the fit for duty numbers that Washington always reports. So in that 11,000 number he reported, he didn't count sick present, but doesn't just by the name of that suggest they're still in camp? Yes, they are. So in this case, just for these two brigades, there's 180 men that are sick present. They're in their huts. They're present. You're feeding them rations. They need to be counted. And then Washington does count the unfit that don't have shoes and clothes, but a lot of times they're not counted. And let me get to this number here, this on command. We used to always think that on command meant detached service away from the camp. We now know that that's not true. If you look at a muster roll, you'll see a column for on command working on Sullivan's Bridge at Valley Forge, or working with the artificer, working at the cook's office, working in the artillery park. Those are soldiers fit for duty. By and large, most of them are still in the camp. They're just not with their regiments. So they're called on command because they're actually present somewhere in the theater. And Washington and his adjutant general, in this case, Scammell, have come up with a fraction. It's 4/7 of those men on any given day can be called upon in an emergency. Read between the lines. That means if you're going to get attacked, right? That means they can grab a gun and help. So they're in the camp. And it doesn't mean that the rest aren't going to be available the very next day or the day after or 3 days later. Maybe they're on a 2-day foraging mission. Guess what? They're going to come back to the huts that they've already built, and they're going to be present maybe between these two, this return and the next week's return. So you got to consider most of these soldiers as present in the camp instead of not present, which is the way they're usually depicted. So when you count all the officers and when you count all these men, you're going to add several thousand more to that 11,000 number. And let me add some things that are not counted on the returns. And it's suggested at the bottom of one of those I was showing you. Normally, when Washington depicts his strength, he never counts artillery. All right. And of course, this always bothered me because if an artillerist goes down in a battle, he's counted as a casualty. So of course he's present on the battlefield. You have to count him as present and fit for duty. Believe it or not, on the returns, George Washington is never counted. None of the generals, major generals or brigadier generals, or any of their staffs or headquarters personnel are ever counted in these returns. And there's could be more than 200 of them on any given day that are at their respective quarters. Militia, which go in and out of the camp, that's the reason why you don't count them. Sometimes on the Valley Forge returns, they are depicted, but they're rarely counted. And I won't spend too much time on this, but remember that left-hand panoramic column I showed you when I talked about all the officers, and I said that those are present and fit for duty. None of the non-present officers, due to being on command or present sick, are ever depicted in 1778 returns, at least at Valley Forge. That only happens later in the year. Okay. So what you have for example, in 1779, you have nearly 1,000 of them on a given day that aren't counted when they are actually present in the camp. And then we have these non-soldier people as well: teamsters, artificers, sutlers, blacksmiths, etc., camp followers and their families, which can add up to another several hundred men. and even area residents. Now, there might only be a couple dozen of them, right? But you got to count all those folks. So when you put it all together, Washington's army is going to have a lot more people that enter it. Now, the other thing I'm going to add in this, and this, of course, is the Memorial Arch of the troops entering at Valley Forge, and it's off the Gulf Road. The idea that all those troops are going to enter in just one day, December 19th, very misleading. If you read the diaries, it appears that even more than half of those men never really entered what is now encompassed by the National Park of Valley Forge. Most of them are still on the road and have pulled off to the side. It's a 2-day entry. So most of those troops entered on December 19th and December 20th. All right. Washington himself, there's no evidence that he was actually in Valley Forge on December 19th. We do have evidence that he's there on December 20th. And I believe that's the day that he actually entered. So think of it as a 2-day entry. And one of the reasons you have to think about it that way is simply by the numbers. This is the corrected number, and I can confidently display this number of the entry strength, numerical strength of the troops that entered Valley Forge. And I'm not going to break down every single column, but when you did everything that I just explained in the previous slides, include the sick present, the non-coms and the infantry and all the officers and the cavalry, which does enter in December before they move out to Trenton in January, but they're technically there. The only troops that aren't there are 2 brigades of Marylanders that used to be Sullivan's brigade. Now they're under Smallwood. They've gone to Wilmington. They never entered Valley Forge in December. They'll come back in June, but they're not part of this number. So when you add it all up and include the artillery, which you have to include, you no longer have this 11,000 number. This is the real number, 19,224. And whenever I display a number, throw the word "at least" in front of it, because that is me lowballing the number. Okay. So now think of 23,000 rations per day. Include these 19,000 men, include the 2 brigades in Wilmington because they're being fed by the same rations, include the troops that are sent out to camps at Lancaster and York, and some of the militia as well. Now you understand why 23,000 rations are distributed, because there are 23,000 mouths to feed. And by and large, most of those mouths are in Valley Forge. All right. So I hope I was able to portray that accurately. So from now on, when anybody ever tells you, and it's probably going to happen in the Ken Burns series that's produced on PBS next year, they're going to talk about 11,000. You can roll your eyes because now you know the real number. All right. And this is one of the maps depicting Valley Forge. The Schuylkill River has an east-west flow to it here, so it forms the northern boundary of the camp. And it's got this triangular shape to it. You have this line of brigades that will move out to Valley Creek, which forms a boundary and then flows over to and empties into the Schuylkill River. By perimeter, that's 8 miles of encampment. By area, I think it's 5 square miles roughly. The entrenchments that you see in the outer works, that's Duportai's efforts here. You'll see that later on. You certainly don't see that at the beginning of the encampment. You don't see the redoubts that are constructed later on as well. But the troops are there, and they're there on December 19th and December 20th. All right. So what does that mean compared to the other cities, or we'll call them population centers? And I'm going to call it civilian population centers in the United States. We have the 1776 data for this. So Philadelphia, we know, is the largest city in the United States of America. That's 34,000 civilians. You add Howe's Army to it, it's actually teeming a little bit past 50,000. New York City, where Clinton's men are attached here, has 22,000 civilians and another 10,000 Crown Force soldiers. So that brings them over 30,000. Now you add in Valley Forge at starting anywhere at 19,000 and dipping below that through the story of the encampment. And you now realize what? It is now the 3rd largest population center in the United States for 6 months. The 3rd largest population center. It is bigger than Boston. All right. I think in the Valley Forge signage, in the historical signage, I think someplace they call it the 5th largest population center, because Charleston is 4th at 12. Well, you know why they call it the 5th largest, because they still adhere to the 11,000. I won't beat on that number too much more. Okay. So how are we going to look at Valley Forge, how are we depicting it? We're depicting it obviously as an encampment force, right? And that's why you got to count all the troops that are there, even if they're unfit for duty and present. Maybe you don't think of them as an attacking force, but you got to feed them, right? But Washington, I'm going to show you in these first days of Valley Forge, is not just looking at it as an encampment force. In fact, he is going to look at it as an attacking force. All right. Again, I am showing a map of the encampment, but it's flipped just to show now that the bottom is north and the top is south. There's the Schuylkill River forming the base. There's your triangular form going to the Valley Creek on the right-hand side and flowing into the Schuylkill. Washington's headquarters are down here near at the lower edge of this triangle where the creek and the river come together. He will start his first night where my cursor is now in a tent, a red and white striped linen tent, not the one that's in the Revolutionary War Museum in Philadelphia. That's a later version of the tent he uses. The one that he had in 1777 and at Valley Forge here in the first day doesn't exist anymore. All right. Most historians will have him moving into his headquarters house in January or very late December. I think it happens earlier. I'll get to that in a few minutes. Here's a period map showing Philadelphia in the seat of war. And I want to show you one thing here. If you look in the center, you see Philadelphia, right? Bordered by the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, right? And if you look to the left, it's about 6 miles out, you see Derby. Now that's the 1770s primary spelling of it. Derby. It was pronounced Darby then. It now is spelled with an A. But that's how it looks. I'm bringing that up because when Washington moves over to Valley Forge, way up here, his spy master, Clark, Major Clark, will inform him that they have gotten word that a large reconnaissance force, actually a forage mission of Crown Force soldiers, 8,000 strong, has crossed the Schuylkill River and is heading toward Derby. And it is led by none other than the Army commander himself, General Howe. Usually those things would be led by Cornwallis, but he's on a ship to England here for the winter, so he's not available. So Howe is on this mission himself. It shows how desperate they are for forage as well. Here's that same area now without the busyness of the period map to it. There's Philadelphia again circled. There's Derby with today's spelling. There's Valley Forge. So Washington now looks at this as an opportunity. All right. Forget about this notion that Washington is the American Fabius. Ever since the beginning of the Philadelphia campaign, he was always looking to attack. All right. You see the first evidence of that, for example, at the Battle of Germantown, where he attacked with 13 brigades simultaneously, the largest simultaneous assault for the next 84 years in American history, not until the second year of the Civil War. So Washington is going to look to even top that now. If you look here, he sees this force coming out to Derby. That means Philadelphia is not going to be well defended. And he knows that a couple of thousand troops of Crown Force soldiers are across the Delaware and in the New Jersey portion of the environs of Philadelphia, manning Fort Mercer, which they've captured about a month and a half earlier, as well as Fort Billingsport and also other foraging missions. So he knows that at this point, based on what his spy master is telling him, that Philadelphia has never been more lightly defended. And Washington looks at this opportunity as an opportunity to strike. So here's the chronology. December 19th to 20th, the Army enters Valley Forge. I've already gone over that. December 20th to 21st, the major generals and engineers start laying out their hut positions. But hut construction does not begin for the next few days, except for some of the artificers on the border of camp. And that's what got me interested in this. I've seen, why aren't they building their huts? I don't see any sign of hut construction for at least the first until the 4th or 5th day at Valley Forge. And I'm wondering, why hasn't that occurred? Well, here's the reason. You're going to see this now. On December 21st at 4 p.m., GW, that's Washington, learns of that plan of how to send a large body of troops to Derby, and he will immediately go to work with one of his aides, probably Tench Tillman, although I can't prove that. And on the night of the 21st, they write out, and we know this because it exists in Washington's papers, the intended orders for a move against Philadelphia by way of surprise, December 25th 25th December 1777, Christmas Day, right? So here's Washington trying to repeat the ingredients of a previous success. We know that from your name of this roundtable, right? What does he do actually on Christmas night? He crosses the Delaware, and that attack occurs the 26th of December in 1776. Now he wants to have a surprise attack on Christmas Day, and that's why he gets immediately to work to put that plan together. Now, most historians will have Washington in his tent at that time. I am convinced that he has already moved to his headquarters house, which is a wonderful place to visit when you go to Valley Forge. That's the Potts house. And this is the way it looked back then and the way it looks now. And Washington will have his office in the first floor east room. His aides will be in the west room. He will have his sleeping quarters upstairs. Mrs. Washington won't come until February, but I think he's here on December 21st. And I say this because general orders on the 22nd have troops parading for an event. And he says on the road at the bakehouse near headquarters. Well, the bakehouse is probably another Potts house that's right on the road, the Nut Road, just a couple hundred yards south of this headquarters. It was nowhere near the tent. So by saying that on the 22nd, I'm sure everybody already recognizes that his headquarters has moved. I think he's here on the 21st, already constructing that attack plan. All right. So here are the highlights of the plan. All right. He's going to have Lord Sterling, who has 2 brigades, Potter's militia, Smallwood, who's at Wilmington. He's at Wilmington with the 2 Maryland brigades, and Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. All of those are going to act together. They number about 6,000 officers and men. And that's how I always depict things. I don't say rank and file, officers and men. They're going to operate against the 8,000 British troops that are going to be around Derby. And they are going to apply Fabian tactics because they're outnumbered. Even though there's a good size of them, they're supposed to draw Howe out toward them by moving a war of post, feign an attack, fall back, fall back. And Washington actually writes this. If Valley Forge is threatened, he says, keep up the appearance of an attack to harass the enemy as much as possible, to afford time for the baggage, etc., to be removed from our present camp if that camp cannot be defended. Now you know why they're not constructing their huts. Washington's not intending them to stay at Valley Forge because he thinks that that encampment will be threatened. But why is he going through all of this? Because he wants to draw Howe further and further away with those 8,000 troops so that he can enact this part of the plan. 13 Continental brigades with artillery, with dragoons, and some militia. They will cross mostly Swedes Ford. They'll funnel over there on the 23rd. And I'm speculating on the dates. I'll get to that a little later because it takes that long to move these troops. Maybe over Matson's Ford as well. They're going to position for their attack, probably near Germantown, although that spot is never specifically cited. They'll be in place on the night of the 24th because the plan definitely, just by the title of the docked plan, is to launch the assault on the 25th December, 1777, Christmas morning. What a way to surprise them. Who's there? No more than 9,000 Crown forces. It might even be as low as 75 to 8,000. A lot of them are in redoubts that are in a line of works just north of the city. I'll show you a map of that in a few minutes. But at least half of them probably are in the city of Philadelphia itself, which is hugging the Delaware side of that little peninsula between the Schuylkill and the Delaware. I'll show you that on the map as well. Washington has called for an equal number of officers and men, to 67 of them, with an officer to be the shock troops, so to speak. That's my word for it. To attack those 10 redoubts. Each redoubt has at least two British cannons in them. To get them by surprise, and these 884 picked officers and men are to assault them, and they're going to be supported by thousands of a second line of attackers. Once those redoubts are captured, there's going to be 2 prongs. One is going to be led by Sullivan, and he's actually named. He's going to lead brigades on the left side, the west side, the Schuylkill side, but in the Philadelphia portion of it, down to the 4 lowest ferries, cut away the military bridges, and basically turn the Schuylkill into a moat so that Howe cannot recross with those 8,000 men. And that way, Washington's able to capture Philadelphia. The second prong, and my guess is it's going to be Nathaniel Greene, even though he's not named in it, probably is going to lead the second prong into the city itself, capture the city, process the new prisoners they're going to get, free all the American prisoners that are already there. Make sense? Take a look at the map. This is the way Philadelphia looked in 1777. You'll see the city itself hugs the Delaware side. There are dwellings here in the western section, but the real population center is over here. There you see that line of redoubts where running from where Kensington is all the way across 2.5 miles between the rivers. 10 redoubts here. The Americans are going to attack from Germantown, moving south. The shock troops are going to get all those redoubts. Sullivan's Prong is going to work all the way down the Schuylkill and free up all those bridges so that he could turn this into the moat. Probably Greene is going to lead that second prong, which is at least named without their commander on the Delaware side. Does that all make sense? Certainly does. And it's quite an audacious plan. And Washington only has a really thin window of opportunity here. That's why he's really putting this together and to act fast on it. But here's what historians have done with this plan. This is Wayne Bodle, one of the more esteemed yesteryear of historians of Valley Forge, and he laughs this whole thing off. What was Washington thinking, right? Skeptics might well conclude, I'm quoting him here, that, by the way, Bodle didn't say ... That's me putting that in there, of course. Skeptics might well conclude that it was indeed the result of a sugar plum reverie gone awry, or a holiday-induced overindulgence in hemp, thinks Washington smoking pot, or a Madeira at American headquarters, right? So he thinks this is such a nonsense plan. Why would Washington think about this? And why does he think it's a nonsense plan? Well, I think you already know the answer. I got to say it again, because he thinks Washington only has 11,000 men, right? And if a lot of those men are with Sterling, Washington's going to attack 9,000 men with just a few thousand. But what he really doesn't appreciate is that Washington's going to attack 9,000 men with 15,000 troops, okay? That's his plan. He outnumbers the troops that he plans to attack with. But I'm going to call this the 1777 solstice setback. Get a little alliteration going in here. And here's the problem that occurs. When Washington's already set the plan in motion, Sterling departs camp with his 2 brigades. He heads toward Radnor. That's where Morgan is. That's where Potter already is. He's already got Huntington's and Barnum's brigade up and ready to march out as backups to Sterling. They'll eventually be supposed to march with Washington, but their diarists and within those brigades have already said they're up and ready to march as well. But Washington is informed that the night before there was, quote, a dangerous mutiny the previous night that he now is being made aware of. And the brigadier generals have tamped it down, but Washington was unaware of this until this day. And then he's informed that the reason for that dangerous mutiny is that there was a simultaneous collapse of the commissary and the quartermaster departments. Now, it's no surprise that Washington has had commissary and quartermaster issues throughout from the late summer. And he's always been bending Congress's ear to help him out in this, but he never had a collapse simultaneously as he did here. And this is when he's learning about all of it this very day. And here's Washington depicted on his at Valley Forge on Blueskin, his dappled Arabian. And what he learns when he calls his commissary of issues, the officer in charge of that, he learns that there is absolutely no meat for those 19,000 men. And there's only 25 barrels of flour, which is only enough for 4 ounces per man for 1 day. That's it. He learns that the soldiers had been chanting no meat and they're cawing like crows as if they're going to fly away and desert the camp. That mutiny was tamped down, but he learns that it's not completely eradicated. Washington's going to suspend the attack. He will immediately fix the problem. We know he fixes the problem. Why? I showed you the early slide. Because 2 tons of foodstuffs enter in December. So it's only a very short problem. It's alleviated within 2 days, where he will send out 1,400 officers and men, and they will forage up to 10 miles, leaving receipts, seizing and bringing in flour, beef, pork, and wheat. And apparently they succeed at it. But he has to file the attack plan away. And on the 12/22 return, that's being conducted this very day just because that's the time of the weekly return. Washington learns that there are 829 men who are listed as unfit for lack of shoes and clothes. Now, he's already very angry about this, and he's written to Congress this day on the 22nd talking about this problem. He hasn't really specified his attack plan to Congress, but he talked about this problem, and he does say first on the 22nd, we always quote the 23rd, but he says this army must dissolve if the problem isn't fixed. He first writes that on the 22nd. But that's when he gets the return, and he sees the shocking number, 829 men. But he sees that only 8 brigades have reported unfit men for lack of shoes and clothes. The rest of them have left that column blank. And even in those 8 brigades, there are some regiments within the brigades that didn't report their totals of unfit men. So in a very rare instance, Washington is going to call for a special field return the very day after he receives a weekly return. You don't hear about this ever happening. So what he calls for in a field return, and it's just a stripped down return. He only wants to know the non-coms that are available. He wants to know the men fit for duty and those unfit for lack of shoes and clothes. And that's where you got that first statement, 2,898 men unfit for lack of shoes and clothes. And what? 8,200 rank and file only fit for duty. Even in the field report, he gets the non-commissioned numbers and he doesn't even report that. So Washington's doing a little bit of propaganda here. When he reports to Congress saying, I only have this many men in camp and this many men in addition that are unfit, that's where we get our 11,000 from. He's actually stripped down his own field return, which is already stripped down, and he's doing it purposely to let Congress know that he's got a low number of troops. He doesn't really talk about the attack plan. He's filed it away, and you got to solve this problem for me right away. And that's when he uses the line, this army must starve, dissolve, or disperse. So that's when the men start going to work building their huts. All right. And by my count, you have 12 men in a hut and a certain number for officers and their staffs. And by my count, based on the number of troops that are in the camp, including all the on command, because they come back from their missions, I have counted 2,200 soldiers' huts just to house the soldiers and the officers as well. A lot of the generals are going to be in houses. Some of them are going to be in huts. And when you count the women and children, when you count the artificers and some of the other troops, it could be as many as 2,400 huts. Howe calls it Washington's log town, and somebody else calls it, one of the soldiers calls it, we are building a great continental city. And indeed, for 6 months it was. It's the 3rd largest population center in the United States. But as you know, as I'm just explaining here, Washington never intended this to be a long encampment. He intended to spend Christmas Day in Philadelphia. Instead, he spends Christmas Day in the Potts House, probably with Baron de Kalb and the Marquis Lafayette and his staff, and they're having a Christmas dinner of mutton and veal and cabbage, and probably lamenting the fact that he had to file away his attack plan. Let me extend this now, just briefly to end the talk today. I've talked about that first week at Valley Forge. I want you, this is numbers that Mike Harris and I publish. Look at this 3rd column. This is total fit and unfit. That's officers and men present in Valley Forge. When that teaching guide that I quoted very early said that the encampment got as low as 5,500 to 6,000. Here they are just counting fit for duty rank and file. But even at that stage, the encampment was really never smaller than the size of Boston, right? And in this case, I forgot to include the staff officers and the generals. This is really still 14,200. Here is the real low, the ebb, right here, that 14,144. So you see the numbers fall, you see the numbers rise again. They entered with 19,000, that immediately drops to 18,000 the very next day when more troops get dispersed. The cavalry goes to Trenton. And by Christmas Eve here, you aren't really having much more than 17,000, and it goes to 18,000 at the end. And the whole story about the phoenix rising from the ashes, well, okay, you dwindle down and you gain troops again because of new levies and recruits and return furloughs and men returning from from the hospitals. But let's revise that story now. I gave you the traditional story. Here's what I think is the accurate story. Washington marched into Valley Forge with 19,224 soldiers on December 19th. At its nadir, the encampment dwindled to 14,000 Continental officers and men at the end of March. Improved camp sanitation, new recruits and returning sick and furloughed soldiers resulted in an army that marched away from Valley Forge on June 19th, 17,850 strong, but they had to leave 3,100 sick ones behind. And a lot of those were left behind because they were unfit for lack of shoes to embark on the Monmouth campaign, probably good vets that never got new clothes. So did the phoenix rise from the ashes at Valley Forge? That's kind of the question I'm leaving with you. I'm only going to tell you this. If you look at what I call the permanent Ds, deaths, desertions, and discharges, you add them together, the total losses at Valley Forge in the 6 months was 5,400 and some change. They added, with mostly new levies, some veterans from 76, but mostly new soldiers, 5,200 to give them about the same number that left that came in. But it wasn't an equal dispersal. I could tell you that 7 brigades got numerically weaker. That includes Wayne's 2 Pennsylvania brigades, that includes all 4 Virginia brigades, and that also includes Varnum's brigade of Rhode Island, Connecticut soldiers. Numerically, they got smaller. And I'm also going to tell you that 2,900 of these 5,200 new recruits came in from May onward. And 115 a day were coming in June. They weren't adequately trained by Baron de Steuben. So a lot of these soldiers that came in that replaced veterans that left by discharges from terms of service and from deaths, a lot of them as well, they can't even come close to replacing the experience or the training of those veterans because they just came into camp late. So the question is, did the phoenix rise from the ashes of Valley Forge? My answer is the phoenix rose, but that great mythical bird probably hovered more than it soared. And I leave you at that. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Gary. Thank you very much. I'm laughing at the hovering phoenix there. It looks like, Bill, you've got a question, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay.
All right, good.
My question is, in the map of the Valley Forge 5 square miles, why was the burial ground dead center in the middle?
I think that was a designated burial ground, but it wasn't. They didn't. The park's position is that there are no burials at Valley Forge. That Washington made when a soldier got too sick and was close to dying, they found a way to get him removed from the camp, or if he died at camp, they had him buried outside the campground. So that was the initial plan. I can tell you that I know of at least one burial in the parade ground, and that was an execution of a Virginia soldier named Riley, because they talk about how they cut the rope and he dropped into a hole they dug right in the parade ground on January 10th. I doubt he was reinterred. So that's the only true burial I know that occurred in Valley Forge.
Other questions? I think you can just raise your hand if you could, and I'll try to see.
Yeah, John Fabiano here.
John.
Gary, that's tremendous, really
Oh,
tremendous
thank you.
research. You know, and I was saying, boy, this I knew exactly where you were going because of your last article in JAR regarding Lee and lack of experienced troops. That's amazing. The scholarship was just fantastic. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you. Did you have a question as well? I'll take the
Well,
comment.
No, the question was, so these are the same troops. Are these Barnes troops? These are troops that Lee explain that Lee trusted the militia troops ahead of Wayne's troops.
Let me explain
with a
that.
Briar Hill attack.
Right. I'll explain that briefly. I always, and it answers a question. I always go into these campaigns asking questions. I talk to myself. And a lot of times I can't answer the question, sometimes I can. And when it comes to the Monmouth campaign, I said, why does Washington resort to an advanced corps of picked men? Why does he do it in that campaign when he doesn't do it in other campaigns? And I think the answer, and I'm quite sure of the answer. I'll bet your lives on it. Is that he Washington was concerned that the new recruits that didn't get trained in time were going to bog down the efficiency of an attack. And he wanted an advanced corps of mostly picked troops to be the best troops available. And they're mostly going to be your veterans that were trained, or even some of your best new recruits that came in early in the encampment, like March or April, where Steuben trained them for 3 months and they got adequate
French and
training.
Indian War veterans.
Yeah, a lot of them. A lot of them would have been that way. Now, when Charles Lee took over the advanced corps, he had over half of his advanced corps were these picked men, but for reasons never explained, because he likes to be a contrarian. Even though Washington had a council of war with him and the brigadier generals leading the picked troops, Lee went off the page and chose the very least efficient troops to lead the attack, and that's the ones that were overburdened with new levies, and never an explanation for that, but that bogged down his advance.
That's just fantastic.
Thank
Hey,
you.
I see a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to read one of them for
Oh,
you.
good.
Joe Relation asks, did I hear straight that there were 2,200 huts? If you multiply that by 12 men each, that's 26,400 beds. So your numbers make a lot more sense.
No,
than
no.
traditional
Yeah,
numbers.
yeah, they're 2,200 huts, but it's 12 rank and file per hut and 12 non-coms per hut. There's one hut per general. There's one hut for field officers and one hut for their staff. So there's some huts that have much fewer than 12 men in them. So I actually went through the whole. I went by the exact the numbers, and I need to get a life because I really broke this all down. For example, Huntington's brigade had 170 huts by my calculation, which was more than Wayne's 2 brigades combined. So some of these were really much bigger. And Justin Clement did a nice job at explaining this. When they actually did the archaeology on the huts, they never really fit the proportion. You have these really weird shaped, smaller huts that got wedged in between the typical 14 by 16 huts just to get them in there to put more men. So they didn't really conform. So I'm confident that there are at least 2,200 huts, but they didn't all have 12 men in them. Some had definitely much fewer than that. So it really adds up more to the 19,000.
As we say at the park, rank had its privileges.
Yeah.
So the higher up in rank, the fewer men per hut.
Right.
Need room to
I
spread
have another question.
Absolutely.
leader. Go on.
Oh, can I ask?
Please.
Yes. Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Does Washington or any of his generals know what was happening when on this past November 9th and 10th, I was down at the Museum of the American Revolution. And on November 10th, there were hundreds and hundreds of Marines there celebrating the beginning of the Marine Corps on November 10th, 1777 on 2nd Street. Did Washington know anything about that?
It was 7. It was 75, I think, not 70.
75.
Yeah, in 77, the British have Philadelphia in November.
Oh.
So yeah. So the answer would be no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, we had a question from Mike.
Now, did he know it in 75? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know 75 as well. I'm sorry.
Mike Hogg asked, where do you get your returns?
Where'd I get my what?
The troop returns.
Oh, they are National Archives. They're in 2 places. They're at the Clement Library in Michigan. That's where Charles Lesser got his when he published his that 1976 Sinews of Independence. I highly recommend that book. We got ours now during COVID. Mike Harris and I were actually out together at White Marsh, Bob. You'll appreciate that. And we were discussing the number of troops there at White Marsh. And we said, well, if there are 24,000 troops at White Marsh, how could there only be 11,000 at Valley Forge? And that's what got us started. If any of you are familiar with the site, it's called fold3.com. That has a lot of archival material published. We found the rest of those returns on Fold 3 because during COVID, all the archives were closed. So thank goodness we were able to get that just from the comforts of our own home at our own computer. So you just need to have a subscription account. You can get on Fold 3 for that.
Very valuable.
Yes, very valuable.
Yeah. Fold 3 is a great site. It's got not just muster and payrolls, it's got service records and wonderful pension accounts for
Pension
Right.
account.
thousands of men.
Yeah.
Very, very worthwhile subscription if you're doing research on this period. And it's not just the period of the American Revolution. There's lots of
Right. It's all military in American history. Right.
some other questions.
These are good questions.
I have one for you.
Sure.
So, you showed us at the start that December 23rd letter that Washington wrote and
Right.
where we got the 11,000 number from, right?
Right.
Why is it that he's not giving the real numbers? What do you think?
Well, I'll say this. Washington, and this is my Civil War experience coming in here. Washington in the 1770s is much like a Confederate general. They always like to strip down their number of troops to those infantry privates carrying a gun as what they call the real fighting troops. So he's not technically doing it to deceive, because throughout the war, he reports everything as rank and file. It's just misleading. And I think historians, especially with the 250th anniversary coming up, if I can bring anything from the Civil War field, where we've corrected this for decades now, we make apples to apples comparison between the Union and Confederate Army. We look more at present for duty strength, and that includes everybody. And you got to look at it this way. I alluded to this. In a battle, if even a drummer is captured or wounded, he's a casualty. If an infantry field officer is injured, he's a casualty. If an artillery private is killed, he's a casualty. So he's obviously on the battlefield, and he has to be counted as present for duty on the field. So you can't do it that way. But on the 23rd, I will add that Washington did add a little bit of propaganda to downplay the numbers, because he chose not to include the non-coms that he called for in the field report. So he did play a little loose with the numbers, because he definitely had a higher return, and he had the December 22nd return right before it.
And did he report like that consistently with?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. He always reported as rank and file.
Yeah.
Always. So in my books, I always try to correct that. And in this next volume, I actually have to have an appendix where I explain the difference between the two. I used to have a little device where you take rank and file and you multiply it by 1.28, and that corrects it for the field officers. Again, I need to get a life because I came up with that calculation, but that's kind of how you do it.
Other questions from the audience? Anybody like to ask a question here? I do see.
Bob, there's on the chat
Yeah.
from Lynn Clemens. Did you read that one, or?
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Lynn Clemens, thank you, Gary, for painting such a clear picture of Valley Forge.
Oh, good.
I've seen the
Thanks.
pension file of my ancestor, who was a young teamster. He claims to have met George Washington, who asked him to come to work for him on his farm after the war. He didn't go, and I suspect never saw Washington again. There are enough hints in this pension file to indicate my teamster was at Valley Forge at some point.
Pretty neat.
Well, if he indeed he was at Valley Forge, by all means, he would have seen George Washington. He would have seen him in the feu de joie, the celebration of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between France and the United States on May 6th. He would have seen Washington on parade grounds for other reasons as well. So, I have no doubt if he was at Valley Forge, he saw George Washington.
Gary, there's a Zoom user is asking, how long were the 8,000 British foragers in Derby gone from Philadelphia?
Oh, and I should have had the answer on the tip of my tongue, and I forgot it. But it was only a few days. I think by the 25th they were starting to return, or no, the 26th, I believe. They were out there for quite a few days. So if the attack was able to occur on the 25th, I don't know if the attack would have worked, but he definitely would have caught Howe still on the west side of the Schuylkill River. So that was, but you should be impressed with the plan, whether you thought it was by the audaciousness of it. He's kind of, we think, again, with a Civil War term, Washington is a lot like Robert E. Lee in the way he plans out these things. He's taking advantage of that opportunity.
But he did press his luck 2 years in a row.
Yeah. But let me add to this though. But pressing his luck, and I'm getting off the page on this, and this comes to a presentation I gave that's on C-SPAN. There, I plugged something I did. Is when he attacked at Germantown, don't consider that battle a failure. If it was the greatest failure in American history, because John Adams, one of the greatest curmudgeons of all time, will when he goes to France, he learns that had as much impact on French recognition as the surrender at Saratoga. And he says probably even more, because they were really impressed that Washington could stand toe to toe with the elite British army, even if he had to draw back from the battlefield afterwards. So yes, he pressed his luck, but him being always with an attacking concept actually paid dividends for the American cause.
Yeah, and he did that just a few weeks after a defeat at Brandywine, which certainly shocked the British.
Yeah, and he was literally decimated in his Continental Infantry at Brandywine. So you would think you would come back and just keep licking your wounds and refit, but he was back out within 2 days going for the attack.
Hey, I've got a small question.
Gary,
Oh, go on.
Go ahead.
Gary,
Yes.
with Hal gone and Clinton and Cornwallis gone, would Kniphausen have been in charge in Philadelphia?
Oh, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And yes, it would have been Kniphausen. His headquarters were in Philadelphia. Yeah, he's actually at John Cadwallader's house at that time. So yes.
But I do believe that there
Thank
were
you.
secret articles that prevented Kniphausen from actually taking control.
Well, if that's the
Yeah.
case, I'm just saying he's the next ranking officer there.
Right, he was, but they did have this, what were called secret articles that that Kniphausen was not able to I don't know.
Ever take charge of the crown
Right,
forces.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a dormant commission, but he still would have been in charge, just as
Yeah, somebody has
happened in
to.
Springfield when Clinton was out. Somebody has to
Yeah.
die for that to happen.
Right, you got to look at it this way. If there's a surprise attack, somebody has to be assigned to take charge. And my guess is it's still Kniphausen. I never explored that more though. That's a reasonable question to look into if somebody else was relegated to that status while Howe was gone.
So we have,
That Cadwallader nugget, is that something you knew in the past or from your recent research?
No, it's something I knew from a few years ago because Howe initially had Cadwallader's house and then it went over to Kniphausen afterwards. And that was after he came back from White Marsh. So I know he would have been there at that time.
Gotcha.
another question in the chat was, did Washington's plan to take Philadelphia have the approval of his Council of Generals?
There's a question. No, you know what? He never called a council. Washington between August and December has called 14 councils of war by my count. They're not all well documented. Some just have a very little blurb about it. And by November, every time he brings up the idea of attacking, all of his generals are declining to do that. So he has such a small window, he doesn't want to discuss it. And he's just going to enact this plan and call for the attack. Now, has this ever occurred before? Technically, no, but in a sense it has. When the attack at Germantown in October, Washington calls a council of war and gives them two options. We're either going to attack now or we're going to attack when McDougal's men arrive. There's no third option of we're not going to attack. So he basically is looking at this Christmas plan as, yeah, I'm going to attack, and they're I can call a council and they can raise objections to it. I usually have them write it out overnight and submit it the next day. He doesn't have time for that. He's already enacting the plan the very next day when he sends Sterling out of the camp. So he doesn't call a council.
Couple of other questions or comments in the chat. Mary Jane Meckling mentions that Washington held a council of war at the Moland House on August 20th of 70.
Right. Yeah, actually, on the 20, he calls that, it's on August 22nd, I believe. And that is actually from the American perspective, the start of the Philadelphia campaign, because that's when he always has a toe pointed toward the Hudson and a toe pointed toward Philadelphia. He's made a decision that they're going to go to the Hudson and support Gates. But then they learned that Howe has moved up the Chesapeake and they turned toward Philadelphia. And the Moland House is the start of the Philadelphia campaign from the Americans' perspective, the way I look at it.
Lynn Clemens also asks, are there records on Washington's bodyguards, like lists of names?
Yeah, there is. And there's a couple diaries, like Fisher is one of them. Offhand, I don't remember the best source to get the names, but they're not on the return.
Godfrey's book.
Whose
Godfrey's
book?
book.
Oh, yes,
Godfrey's-
right. I bet you was wondering though if they're in the returns, and the answer is they are not in the returns. They are not in the returns, unless there is a chance, because Morgan's men, that Morgan's riflemen aren't in the returns either, but they are really in there. They are on command troops from other regiments and brigades because it's a specialized force. So
There are muster rolls of them.
yeah, they're muster rolls, but they're technically on command from other brigades. They're never depicted separately in the Valley Forge encampment.
Carlos Godfrey, New Jersey archivist,
Right,
wrote about
right,
them.
right.
So Gary,
And Fisher's the diarist for them too.
Gary, you're saying that if we were to look at a muster roll of Morgan in December of 77, that those individuals listed are on command from other regiments and will be listed in those regiments as on command?
Well, I only have brigade returns, but they're in the section in the brigade return on command from the regiments that Morgan's men are pulled from. They aren't, there's not a separate column for Morgan. They're on command from those brigades that they originally derived from.
I'll have to do a little comparison with the regimental muster rolls in the companies. That'd be interesting.
And
I
this
got one
happens
question.
during the Monmouth campaign too. They, when they do the picked forces, they end up being on command from the brigades that they picked them from.
Yeah, his strength was up to 600, I believe, is what Gary would Stone and Lender have. His
Yeah,
force is
Lender
all
has
the way
it.
up to 600.
It's actually, let me revise that.
Okay.
He's actually got 400 to 500 riflemen by May, but they will call for 25 picked men and quote, a spirited officer from all the brigades that had crossed at Coryell's Ferry, because they come the very next day. This is on June 22nd. I recently wrote about it, that's why I remember it. And so that is another 600 men in addition, or no, excuse me, another 500 men in addition to his pre-existing riflemen. So Morgan's specialized force in the Monmouth campaign numbers over 900 officers and men.
Wow.
He
Over
also
900.
had Washington's Guard with him.
Right, 73 of them, and then he has 2 companies of the North Carolina Brigade. So it's a big force, and there'll be some militia attached to it too. That number will peak out over 1,000 officers and men, and I count it as officers and men. So it's big, and they're very misused in that campaign.
Hey, Jason also asks, where can he find historical information and facts about Washington's bodyguard, textbooks, manuscript? I think there's somewhere around here, I have a book about Washington's Immortals, I think it is. Is that it?
Washington's Enforcers.
Enforcers, that's the one.
Enforcers, yeah.
Remember who wrote it?
He's in Ohio. It cost me $300 to get that thing.
That's how you know it, right?
Harry
Yeah.
Ward's book.
Who wrote it?
Well,
Harry
I
Ward.
have to dig it up.
our old friend out here in Virginia,
Could you say his name again slowly, Bill?
Harry Ward, W-A-R-D.
W-A-R-D.
One of the, written maybe 15, 20 books on the Revolution, one of the
Harry
founders of the
M,
Round
yeah.
Table.
Very
Oh,
good.
Yeah.
Well, my book doesn't cost $300. I think it only costs 30. So keep that in mind.
I'll buy 10 of them.
The link is in the chat to pick this book up from Westholme. Good book, well worth it. I recommend it.
Thank you very much.
Hey, if
Definitely.
aren't any other questions, then I'm going to just show you what's coming up for us in the Washington Crossing Roundtable in the coming months. Okay, so let me scroll down here. You should be able to see our upcoming meetings. In March, we're going to hear from Alan Pell Crawford about the war in the South. And this is based on his recent book, This Fierce People. John Weaver, who is an historian very interested in riflemen, is going to talk with us in June. And he was a recipient of a Swan Historical Foundation Fellowship through the American Philosophical Society and the David Library, the American Revolution. This is going to be a really interesting talk. If you're interested in riflemen, this would be a good one. Our own Joe Robleski, who's with us tonight, is going to speak with us in September about William Franklin, enemy to the liberties of this country. And then Sean McGee, who has published a couple of books about the period of the Revolution, is going to talk with us next year in December about two printers who kind of engaged in a press war in during the early Republic. So stay tuned for that one as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and thanks once again to the Swan Historical Foundation for supporting our roundtable for the last 21 years. Gary, thanks so much. This was a great talk this evening. Really glad that
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary.